So I think we all know that the state of our democracy in 2023 is being challenged. Visible political polarization confronts us in our daily news and social media soundbites, resulting in an ever-deepening divide. 3 in 10 Americans cite political extremism or polarization as the third most important issue facing our country. And according to a January 2022 NPR Ipsos poll, nearly 2/3 of Americans feel that American democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. 2/3. So just take world events in the last few weeks. On the one hand, massive tragedy in the Middle East, to an amazing victory with Stanford's football team coming from behind to beat a very cocky Colorado, and then back to deep divisions on Capitol Hill with the House speakership in chaos again. This dialogue over differences, top of mind, I know for me and my family, top of mind for alums, students, and professors alike. So I'm going to start off this afternoon by trying to find some unity amongst all of us panelists up here today, and I think we found it through music. So I am a classical violinist, then we have Condi on piano, and it turns out that Larry dabbles with the bass. So I think we can all harmoniously come together with the trio, and then Jenny and Jim, can you pick up an instrument, please?
Sure.
Okay. So at least we start off with finding some sort of harmonious start. I want to set the stage first with what seems to be a simple question, but maybe not so much anymore. And it's 2 words. Why democracy? Who wants to take a stab at it?
Condi wrote a book about it.
So did you. Well, why democracy? Because to quote any number of people, including Churchill, we haven't found anything better. There is no way of organizing human beings that allows them to say what they think, worship as they please, be free from the knock of the secret police at night, and choose those who would govern them. Those are the basics of democracy. Now, the other thing I'll say, Gretchen, in response to some of the elements that you stated at first, it's also really hard. I'm very often asked, so why do democracies fail? And I say, no, the question is, why do they succeed? Because it actually is not easy to get human beings to agree that they are going to channel their passions, their hopes, their fears, their interests through these abstractions that we call institutions, constitutions, and rule of law, and elections. And it's a relatively young concept. When the American founders kind of came up with this idea of self-governance at the end of the 18th century, it was a really peculiar idea. And so I think we're very fortunate that we have institutions that can channel these passions. But I will say, in response to what you've just put before us, it doesn't happen inevitably that we can keep the republic that we've been given.
Larry, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I would build on what Condi said with a couple of points. First of all, as a social scientist, I can say that if you look at the statistical evidence, you will find pretty unambiguously, number one, that all the countries that do a very good job of protecting human rights, individual freedoms, and a rule of law also happen to be democracies. They choose their leaders through free and fair elections. And all of the countries that have the worst performance in abusing human rights in every respect, including all the ones that Condi spoke about, are authoritarian regimes. Now, there's a lot of messy middle as well. Moreover, if you go to the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, they have a long list of papers under the aggregated title of the business case for democracy. And the business case for democracy is what Condi alluded to. It just works better. Democracies over time have had higher and better sustained rates of economic growth, more economic freedom. better provision for health care and better protection of the environment. And let me just say one last thing. There's a lot of, I think, very patronizing argumentation that, okay, but it's democracy because you want it in your Western culture. Don't force it on us. And I think this is what we explore in our college class, spring quarter, Jim Fishkin and I, the spirit of democracy. But if you look at a wide array of cultures, including from Asia, including from Africa and so on, there's some very interesting recent work done on traditional African cultures. You find elements of liberal democracy, of rule of law, of constraint of power, of accountability, of protection for individual rights, of some fundamental elements of justice in civilizational traditions that we don't think of as belonging to a kind of Scottish Enlightenment tradition. It's a universal concept.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? Because my next question is, what's at stake here if we don't preserve this?
Well, we have to preserve it, but we also should improve it, renovate it, because our democracies in the US and in most countries around the world have very low approval ratings. Our institutions have low approval ratings. We are facing a legitimacy crisis. And I think that there are certain key things that could be done to help with that. But certainly, everything you say about the central value of democracy is absolutely true. But you know, we see it's under threat with various alternatives. The China model, technocratic alternatives. It's under threat with people who advocate getting rid of elections and substituting something else. So, and our Constitution, our Supreme Court, the level of respect for all of these institutions, the Congress, look at the Congress's approval ratings. It must be as hardly better than used car dealerships. So I think that we need to think seriously about how to improve it, because we have a system which is hard to change because our Constitution makes it very hard to change. So we need to think about, within civil society, at the state level, various ways that we can improve it. Larry and I are very much engaged in this, and I want to talk about that before we're done.
Of course, yes, we're going to get to some of your ideas that you have to improve it. Jenny?
Well, I'll just build on that. As a professor of constitutional law, one of the things that is distinctive about the US Constitution is how old it is and how little it has been changed. And the ways in which our country has adapted over time certainly have involved amendments, but also that civic culture. And it is that participation by people in the life of government and engagement that really has sustained the Constitution and has enabled it to adapt over time. And that level of civic engagement, I think, is required to ensure that those systems of checks and balances and limitations on government are in place appropriately to constrain government power, but don't render the system unworkable. Don't make it such that we can't get anything done. And that requires participation of the citizenry.
You know, if I could just, on that point, I do think the Constitution has been remarkable in the degree to which change has been possible within it. If you think about the United States as a slaveholding state when it was originally founded, I have a little story that I often tell, which is that, of course, my ancestors were slaves. My ancestors were also slave owners. We have to remember that about slavery. But I was being sworn in as Secretary of State, and you're sworn in the Benjamin Franklin room. And it's a huge portrait of Benjamin Franklin above you. And while I was being sworn in, I thought to myself, I wonder what old Ben would think of this, right? You've got this black woman, descendant of slaves, and actually she's being sworn in by a Jewish woman Supreme Court justice named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, Ben, so as it turns out, Ben Franklin is my favorite founding father, isn't he? Everybody's favorite founding father, maybe Alexander Hamilton. But I thought, oh, he would have loved it. He would have loved it. But the truth is, he would never have imagined it, right? And so, frankly, neither would have I imagined it growing up in segregated Birmingham. I don't think Ruth would have imagined it when she was trying to get her voice heard in law school. And so I agree, we need to keep improving it. But I get nervous when people talk about improving it outside of the context, not you, but I hear this, outside of the context of what a constitution that's actually served us pretty well, largely because, and you know this, Jenny, Americans have this spirit of constitutionalism. We kind of think of the Constitution as our personal protector. So if I think you have abridged my rights, I will take you all the way to the Supreme Court under Constitution. So I think we do have to keep improving, but we've got a pretty terrific framework through which to do it.
So even the idea that we're questioning all of this now over the last 5 to 10 years, the big question in the room is, how did we get here? And I was looking at a Gallup poll that came out this week, the lowest trust in the media ever amongst Americans. If I ask the panelists, how did we get here? Do we factor in cable news? Mm-hmm. And when did the... And when did the compromise, the idea of compromise, become the ugly C word on Capitol Hill?
Everybody's in an enclave, or they tend to be. If they consult the media, they consult sources that are congenial to them, that may tell them what they want to hear, and where corporations can make money by selling advertising to those, by reaching those eyeballs. I mean, that's the truth. And conversation with the like-minded can go to extremes. That's friend Cass Sunstein wrote several books about this, going to extremes. So we need to think about how to pierce those enclaves and get dialogue across difference, serious dialogue, but not with made-up stuff, because we're also being polluted by bots and by disinformation. And how can we get evidence-based discussions, and how can we get good information across our differences, which people can not only express, but learn to listen to from the other side? And that's one of the things that we're learning.
So let me say, social media has driven us in a very deep hole. And we know a major reason why, that the business model of social media is not consistent with civility and rational debate and intelligent absorption of information. Social media thrives on outrage, emotion, anger, fear, because these are the emotions that fixate people on the platforms. And the business model of most social media companies is what another graduate of Stanford, Tristan Harris, has called attention addiction. And the more you can fixate people's attention on these platforms through outrage, anger, and essentially negative emotions, because that works much better than humor and positive visioning, the more money you're going to make, both through capturing people's data and monetizing that, and through the sale of ads. Shocking, highly ideological, let's mobilize anger and cynicism radio in the kind of late 80s. And then, cable television and its fragmentation into politicized audiences. I'm not sure it can be repaired. You would probably have better insights on that than all the rest of us. but we do need to find ways to transcend it and at least supplement it and leaven it with better information and better dialogues.
Yep. Well, I often say that the invention of cable news 25 years ago was brilliant because it was at the time where people were already getting their news during the day when they were at work. So when they got home at night, now they wanted to see opinion based on what they had heard. But it's really just evolved into silo television. And the reason, one of the odd reasons I know this is because when I still walk through the airport, I have people telling me that they still love me on Fox News. And I'm like, oh my God, obviously they never heard about what I did at Fox News on Fox News, but it's unbelievable that in their brains that they're still thinking that because they never watch anything else. Mm-hmm. Do the women on the stage have any comments about that?
I was just going to add that in addition to the sort of separation in media, whether online or on cable, that there are also statistics about the increasing separation of Americans in where they live and work and interact with one another. So that the trends towards the distribution socioeconomically of how often people intersect with someone who is either much wealthier or much poorer than them in their neighborhood, how many Republicans and Democrats are living in the same neighborhood, how people of different races, the segregation in K through 12 education has been increasing. And so even in their physical real world lives, I think a lot of the data shows that Americans are more separated from people who are different from themselves than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I think that feeds into it as well.
I completely agree with that. In fact, I remember that after the 2016 election, when there were people who said, oh, I think I need to go and see what those people in Alabama think. Well, if you have to do an anthropological dig on your fellow citizens, we have a problem. And I think the problem is that we don't know each other very well. We don't have very many common experiences. There are those who believe that one answer to that might be some version of national service, voluntary or not. And I do think that people that have those experiences, so for instance, I'm a great fan of Teach for America because I will have a student who will come in and it's a kid who is sort of blonde and blue-eyed, and I'll say, where are you going? And they'll say, I'm going to the Mississippi Delta to teach. And I'll think, boy, are you in for a surprise. But that young person is never going to be the same because they will have worked with and encountered people who are different. And so I do think we're siloed in terms of the way that we get our information. And if I could just mention, it's particularly going to be a problem because we are all nostalgic for another time. Our students don't remember another time. And it means that the responsibility of the university to break through those silos is even greater when we talk about young people who wouldn't recognize the name Walter Cronkite if you emblazoned it on the floor.
That's such a great point. Yeah. I mean, because we're looking at it from our generation and our perspective, but young people have no idea what we're talking about. Which brings us to, I think, what the audience came here for, which is what are the solutions? How do we try to bridge these gaps that we have found ourselves in right now? So, Larry and Jim, I know that you have been very involved in something called deliberative democracy. What is it?
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay.
I mean, he's the inventor of it, so I should hear it first from him.
Well, except it's really taken off once I met that guy. But we do, so the idea of deliberative democracy and a method I have called deliberative polling is to see what the people would really think if they thought about an issue together and if they had access to good information, if they got their questions answered, but mostly if they listened to each other in a civil way. And so we take national random samples or the sample of a city or a state or whatever, and we've done 130 of these projects around the world where we take a sample and we bring it together either physically or online. We have, with computer scientists here, we've developed a special platform that makes it really much less expensive and easy for people to deliberate and see each other in small groups. So the 500 people up to 1,000 people. We did 1,000 people with climate change in the US recently. They deliberate in these small groups and they work through the issues, pros and cons of different proposals. They think about them, and we have a survey at the beginning and a survey at the very end of the process. And sometimes the changes are remarkably dramatic, 40 points. So it shows what was lying behind. Very often, initial views that you see in polls are just an impression of sound bites and headlines, or they may not even exist because people don't like to say they don't know. So a late friend of mine, George Bishop, did studies about the Public Affairs Act of 1975, which people had views about or answered, but it was fictional. There was no Public Affairs Act in 1975. So some of the polling results you see are like that. But then some of them are just a wisp of information, you know, headlines, impressions. But what would people really think? So we've been doing these now for a number of years, but what surprised us in this age of extreme partisan polarization, because we've done several projects where we found the same thing, is that when people deliberate together, not only do you get an estimate of what the people together really would think, but you also depolarize. They move much closer together. The divisions are greatly diminished, and a way forward is clarified. So we're also now experimenting with ways to try to spread this kind of deliberative process to the broader society. But it works over and over. And these are national controlled experiments with good samples recruited by NORC at the University of Chicago, which is basically the best survey organization in the US, or one of the two best. And so it really, so not like all these polls, you get a lot of polls where it's almost junk what's being collected. But academic survey organizations of really high quality, you can actually get a picture of public opinion as it is, and then as it would be if people really engaged and thought about it. And all over the world we find that people make a lot of sense. I mean, we've done this in Africa, in Uganda and Ghana and Senegal and Malawi. We've done it in South Korea just did one sponsored by the National Assembly on how to fix its electoral system. We just did and nationally televised. My part was translated into Korean, but the point is that we do this everywhere. The public is smart and open if they think their voice matters. And most of the time, people don't think their voice matters, so they don't bother to think about the issues. Anthony Downs years ago called this rational ignorance. But sometimes in a situation where you're going to be discussing with others, it's not rational ignorance. It becomes rational to become more informed, but also to listen, because if you just give people information, it may backfire. So, but if you can get them to discuss, it may initially backfire, but then they may open up to the other side, which is what you'll see in this short video that CNN did about one of our projects.
So, Larry, how do you sum up what we saw there? What happened?
So, what happened was an exercise in civility and the kind of in-person engagement across the divides, Jenny, that you were eloquently speaking about, that too little happens in American society anymore. You know, Robert Putnam has written, both as a social scientist and an American citizen, very powerfully about the disappearance of bridging capital. We're not interacting across our differences very much anymore. It's the disappearance of national service. He used the metaphor of bowling leagues. They've disappeared. So we have to find other ways to bring people together across difference. And part of the secret of deliberative polling or broader deliberation is to get people to deliberate with diverse others. And that's what you saw in the video. I want to make just a couple more points. Number one is that you can't just throw people together. It's going to be very well prepared. I think, if I may say so to our provost, that there are really interesting possibilities here for our student body. I think many of us know we need to try something. But it's got to be prepared. And so when you put together a briefing paper on the issues, or a background briefing paper, and believe me, they are really asking for it now on the issue of our moment, which is the Middle East conflict, and you vet it with diverse experts, with competing points of view, and it's got balance, and then you give them pro and con arguments that are on their face fair-minded, they've got something to work with, and also some boundaries that rule out crazy stuff. And so it sets a tone. And then if you bring them in and you also say, we have very few ground rules here, but one is that you have to come here with an attitude of mutual tolerance and mutual respect, and we want you to share your views, but you have to be willing to listen as well. That changes everything. It sets a tone that's very much needed. And people do rise to the occasion. That's something else we found. The second thing is that in addition to the very big changes in policy orientation that we have found over and over in these polls, and we've now done 3 national sample American one rooms, in Dallas in 2019, what you saw, online dealing with climate and energy in September 21, and just recently on democratic reform, again, using the online platform of the crowdsourced democracy lab developed by Stanford MS&E professor Ashish Goel. And we got big changes in policy orientations, and in different directions depending on the issue. In Dallas, they moved toward more tolerant and open-minded views about immigration across party lines. They moved in the other direction, away from some very big spending programs, including Medicare for All, that after they deliberate on it, a lot of people kind of in the middle thought, you know, it's too expensive. So it's not geared one way. But one thing we have found over and over that's been stunning, and I'm not sure we entirely expected it, is dramatic reductions in partisan polarization, in what the political scientists call affective polarization, emotional polarization. In short, they came out of this exercise with less animus toward one another, because they had to confront real human beings who they realized were not wearing horns on their head. And that, I think there's a very big lesson in that.
Yeah, at another place you talked about voter registration and voting access, and
in the recent poll.
Yeah, so only 30% of Republicans initially supported providing access to voter registration online, but after deliberations, they moved to majority support, joining Democrats. There was another example about restoring voting rights to convicted felons, which also moved in a wide direction. What about to ensure that votes are accurately counted, which was more of a Republican concern, and then that also Democrats decided to be more concerned about.
There was movement in each direction, depending on the issue.
And finally, that all voting machines produce a paper record of the vote that the voter verifies and then drops in a ballot box. That also showed a big swing.
Okay, let me tell you, as a political scientist, the single most shocking finding, and we've just wrestled the results today in an analytical call, that I was not expecting. We ask, and many polls ask, to what extent are you satisfied with the way democracy is working in our country? And there's not a lot of satisfaction going in. I think it was about 28%. And when they finished, you know, satisfaction with the way democracy is working in the United States, just as a result of the poll, increased about 15%. And for Republicans, it went from about 22% to 52%.
Wow.
So I don't know, there's something, people are hungry for this, and they feel better about democracy after they've done it.
I want to pick up on what you said, Larry, about education, because I do think it's really fundamental to what we do with our students, not only to prepare them to take advantage of the education they'll receive at Stanford and their classes, but also in preparing them to go out into the world as citizens. And to give two examples of what we're doing in our curriculum, one from the law school, where I was until very recently the dean, is a program called E Pluribus that was piloted by a couple of my faculty, where we bring students together, and the premise of that program is students come in a pair. They have to bring a classmate with whom they disagree about something important. And in that program, what the faculty do is first begin with some background information about why it's important to consider perspectives other than your own. Some of the social science research on things like confirmation bias and groupthink. And then they spend some time doing skills building exercises on things like active listening. You might think that you're a good listener until you actually go through some of the exercises to see, are you actually retaining what other people say to you? And they start with some of those things on low stakes topics where people aren't so busy thinking about what they want to say or their emotional reaction to the topic, to practice those skills. And then they go into the structured readings on controversial issues like abortion or affirmative action. And what those faculty have found is that once you've gone through those steps of preparing students and teaching them skills that maybe we would have taken for granted a generation ago in terms of listening, that the conversations are much more constructive. And then for our undergraduates in the new first-year college program, where we have students engaged in courses examining what their education is for, looking at citizenship in the 21st century, looking at global issues, getting them in small groups where they can have those kinds of conversations and skills under guidance. I think it's another place where we're looking at how do we build that up in our students so that they can go out in their classes later in their education here at Stanford, and then when they leave the university with more skills than the average person has.
I also wanted to touch on something that happened here in March with Judge Duncan, who came on behalf of the Federalist Society to speak at the law school. And what's become a very well-known memo now was something that Jenny put out called the Martinez memo, where at first you apologized to the judge for the behavior that he had to face when he was giving his speech. But then you wrote this very long memo, really going back to law, to support your points about why we need to listen to both sides. Can you expound upon why you did that, what the consequences were for doing that, because you knew not everyone was going to agree with you, and how you came to that conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important in a moment like that to think about our role as educators and teachers. And so one of the reasons that I wrote such a long memo that included a lot of First Amendment law and other things was in my role as a teacher of trying to explain to our students here why it's really important that we protect speech even when we disagree with it, and that that's really fundamental to our democracy. And also that there are many ways of expressing disagreement with views that don't involve disruption or silencing a speaker, and to communicate why it's important that students be aware of those and think about how they channel their voices in a way that furthers that kind of conversation rather than just trying to shut down the things that they disagree with. And so I think it does speak to this moment and what the role we have as an institution is, particularly fundamental at the law school, where the very role of lawyers is to resolve disagreements and to grapple with arguments on the other side. But I think it's also applicable to undergraduate education and other fields and professions because of the diversity of views in our society and in any democracy, and the way that whether it's disagreement about a scientific topic or anything, that we need to be training our students to have the skills to engage substantively with the ideas that they disagree with. And it goes back to this point, Larry, that I think you talked about of some people will call it civility, but what I like to think about is it substantive? Are you shouting and name calling, or are you addressing the substance and saying, well, I disagree with your argument, and here are the reasons why, and here is the evidence that supports my side of this. And it's through that kind of substantive engagement that we do see the progress, I think, that you see in something like the deliberative democracy, where people are able to understand one another better and reach some more common ground.
If I could just, I also think we have to model it in the classroom. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure that we always do. I try very hard. I'm well known for certain views. I'm well known for having served in an administration that did certain things. And so I try to be very careful when I'm putting together a syllabus to, in fact, put together a syllabus that has some of the harshest criticisms of what the Bush administration did, because it is not my job to tell them what to think. I'm just trying to get them to engage material in a serious way, to recognize that actually facts matter. I tell my students all the time, don't argue that what happened today affected what happened yesterday. That just doesn't work. And I would get a fair amount of that. I don't think we spend enough time having our students do structured argumentation, where they actually have to have an argument, where they actually have to support it, where they actually have to look at what an alternative explanation would be, and then they have to sum it up. And I taught a course for 10 years called Challenges and Dilemmas in U.S. Foreign Policy. They wrote a 5-page paper every week. And I read 25 5-page papers every week, but one of the reasons was to get them to do this structured argument. So the first papers would always be kind of all over the place, and I would say, we used to do what was called an outline. So how about you don't just wander to the end and hope for the best? Let's try to structure this argument. And I think in our education, we spent a lot of time learning how to structure an argument. We need to do that more with our students.
So I want to take it up a notch from students to our U.S. leaders. Condi, I'm looking at you. What recommendations do you have for our U.S. leaders about trying to bridge the divide?
Well, try to bridge the divide. I think that a compromise is built into the fabric of democracy. Madison talked about constant contestation, and at some point, we will come to a conclusion on something, but I'm not your enemy. I won this one, you might win the next one, and we move on. And I'm saddened to see that I was talking to a friend who was working in a campaign in Pennsylvania, and I said, when is the last time that a candidate actually said, here's what I'm going to do, rather than here's what I'm going to stop them from doing? And somehow it's become so adversarial and so much about pushing the other person into the corner. But sometimes as I'm going through this, I actually blame us more than I blame them, because that's a response to what they believe is, shall we say, career enhancing, is to behave in that way. And we all say we want our politicians to compromise, and we want them to take on hard questions, and we want them to do something about entitlements, because we all went, and then we vote them out of office if they do. So what are they supposed to do? And so I think somehow the great mass of Americans have got to start to model in our voting behavior that actually just dividing and conquering is not career enhancing. And maybe we'll get a little bit better reaction from our leaders. I will say one thing, the Founding Fathers were really smart about one other thing. We tend to focus on Washington, but if you go down to the states, partly because governors have to pass balanced budgets, very often they have to reach across the aisle and work with legislators who are of different party. You will find that they are problem solvers more than perhaps in the federal government. And so as you get down the levels of government, I think you find more of what we would hope democracy looks like. And so when I want to feel good about democracy, I think about what the states are doing.
Well, I was asked to share a couple of pointers or key ingredients that I found over the last few years in working on Capitol Hill to pass two bipartisan laws. And so I just wanted to share that, first of all, the issues that I'm fighting are silencing mechanisms in the workplace that keep bad behavior secret, quite honestly. And there's been an explosion of these silencing mechanisms, NDAs, and something called forced arbitration over the last 40 years, which is why we thought we had solved everything until the Me Too movement started. And so because of my experiences at Fox, I think that helped me to gain access to many Republican offices when I started walking the halls of Congress to try and introduce some of this legislation. But also because of what I did in taking down Roger Ailes at Fox News, it also gave me a whole new audience of people on the left. So it was sort of like the perfect storm of being able to try to bring both sides together on an issue that I quite honestly believe is apolitical. And that would be the first thing that I would say when I would walk into whomever's office, is that this issue is apolitical, and they could hardly wait to share with me stories about things that had happened to their wife, their mother, their daughters, their nieces, their granddaughters, et cetera. So they were proving my point about trying to come together. And I often say that it's a collection of strange bedfellows, but a vote is a vote, and a vote is a vote. Mm-hmm. For example, the co-sponsors of my legislation are two people that probably don't agree on anything else other than this, which is Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican, South Carolina, and Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat, New York. I've been successful in bringing them together for both of those bills to pass them, and now a third with age discrimination and forced arbitration. Also bringing together Senator Marsha Blackburn, very conservative Republican from Tennessee, and Senator Dick Blumenthal, very liberal senator from Connecticut. Some of the people that have been in the news recently, Representative Matt Gaetz, he actually supports my forced arbitration law. So I come back to a vote is a vote, is a vote is a vote. And when you need 10 Republicans in the Senate to pass a bill into law, I can tell you that that arduous process was about 5 years. And every time I got another Republican, my kids and I had a happy dance in the kitchen. But building that bipartisan coalition that took so long was part of my strategy in trying to go back to take another bite out of the apple for more. And so after we passed the Ending Forced Arbitration of Sexual Assault and Sexual Harassment Act, should have come up with a better name, and the president signed it in March of 2022, we immediately went back to work with that same bipartisan coalition for NDAs, the second evil. And within a span of 8 months, we were able, in this Congress, to pass another bipartisan bill into law called the Speak Out Act in December of last year. So within 8 months, within 8 months, two of the biggest labor law changes in the last 100 years. Very fulfilling for me because I'm helping millions of people that I will never meet. And I'm going back for more because at my organization we believe that no protected class should be subjected to these silencing mechanisms. So those are some of my key ingredients of how I've been able to bring the parties together, but it's usually finding common ground from the outset and sharing stories and listening, to your point, Jim, and how important that is. So let's move on to how people in the audience can apply things that you're discovering to their own lives and some of the divides that you all feel, whether it's within your own family or with your friends, and something that's just become so exacerbated over the last 4 to 5 years. So let me start back with you, Jim. In deliberative democracy, what are the hopes and dreams for that as far as growing it and involving more people in this process?
Well, working with Ashish Goel here at Stanford in management science and engineering, we have this platform so that in principle, we could have millions of people deliberating, which we would like to do. We just have to figure out how to get the last mile, how to connect with them. So we're starting with civic groups and universities around the country, high schools, not for deliberative polling, because those are not representative samples, but the experience of deliberation leads to a greater sense of efficacy. It leads to people wanting to become more informed. It leads to higher rates of voting. It leads to people actually connecting their viewpoints with how they vote instead of just connecting their party label to how they vote. And so we think it's good for democracy. How exactly to scale it, I don't know. But in an informal setting, people can think about how to listen, how to sort through an evidence-based discussion, because we've got so much weird, I say information, but some of it's not information circulating through social media. Some of it is just made up stuff designed to inflame and then bots liking it so that it rises to the top. I mean, all kinds of weird things. So trying to get people to sort through information with reasonable sources and get to the bottom. We're being destroyed by what's called motivated reasoning, where people want to hear what they want to hear and they stick to it. But there's another kind of motivated reasoning, which is accuracy-based motivated reasoning. When people work on something together, they try to get to the bottom of it and discover the truth. And it also is effective, but it's harder for social media to make money out of that, but it's there in our and there's also something called the contact hypothesis. Psychologists have found that when people work together on something, they have more respect for each other, and the antipathy that they have disappears. That goes back to Gordon Allport and his book on prejudice, written, God, I don't know how many years ago, decades ago, let's just say. So I think that there are a lot of things that are just common sense. What we did with the deliberative poll is we just put the common sense stuff together, and all of a sudden it created something new. But in our interpersonal relations, in our communities, in the civic organizations that we're involved in, we can practice the same art of mutual respect and civility.
Mm-hmm. So Thanksgiving dinner's coming up for all of us. I know there's certain topics with my family that we just now stay away from, but how do we start talking about that again, Larry? I know that you abide by something called trigger words or trigger conversation. What do you mean by that?
Well, when people walked into our small groups, whether in person or online, after having read our briefing papers, some of the words they did not encounter in the briefing papers were Republican, Democrat, Trump, Obama, and Biden. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious. Try not to wear the most polarizing signals on your forehead, Start and try to look for common ground. We all exist in a universe where we have a kind of circle of opinion, sentiment, beliefs, things we value, and then the family member maybe you've grown distant from or are in tension with, or the neighbor or whatever, they have a circle as well. Almost always, there's some shaded area in what we call the Venn diagram when you look at those two circles. So beyond avoiding the obvious triggers, my advice is try and do a little mental analysis of that Venn diagram. You probably know, your relative, your father, whatever it might be, well enough to imagine some of that. And start by building out from what you share in common. And try and inch out from that to see how you can maybe think about certain issues where some of the underlying values you do share in common can be activated. So that's one piece of advice. Sometimes on the stuff that's most polarizing, don't go there. Change the subject. Talk about where you can find some common ground. And just one other thing that occurred to me, I think this is something I've really been impressed with in these deliberative exercises, because I've come to it through my interaction with Jim. He's the one who's developed it. And at first I thought, there's this ridiculous exercise in these small groups. We alternate between the small group deliberations and then plenary sessions with experts with different points of view. And at the end, the small groups need to formulate and agree on 2 questions to pose to the plenary session. And they spend some time kind of debating what are the 2 questions going to be. And I thought initially, oh, this is kind of a waste of time. And it occurred to me, watching the groups, watching them deliberate, that a common project as seemingly trivial as, okay, what are the 2 questions that we're going to pose to the experts, built some commonality. It's a little bit of what Condi was saying about it doesn't even rise to the level of a common experience in national service, of course, but anything that requires collaboration across lines of difference is positive. And I'd say if you've got a family member that you're kind of in a lot of friction with, maybe you could go together, and volunteer for 2 hours at a food bank. That's probably something you could agree on.
Good suggestion. I want to go back to Jenny because after the Martinez memo came out, you actually instituted mandatory education for the students. And was that in your mind? I mean, how did you come to that solution in trying to bring people together and to not have a situation again that developed in March?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to our role as an educational institution where we want to do things that help our students learn. And so one of the great things that we saw at the law school was participation by alumni. So we had alumni of the law school who are prosecutors and defense counsel, who are judges who were appointed by Republican presidents, judges appointed by Democratic presidents, all of whom share the belief that particularly in the legal system, which is a central part of our democracy and resolving disputes under rule of law, that had just seen from their experience in the profession and in their careers and in their lives how important it was to be able to engage with those that one disagrees with. And so one of the things that I think as alumni of the university that people can do is think about how they go out into their communities and what they do with the education they received at Stanford. Whatever discipline it was in, there are lessons that you probably learned here on campus from interacting with people who are different from you, and how can you bring that back into your community? And one of the things that I am a big proponent of is civics education. A bunch of our Stanford alums who were on the Supreme Court, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Justice Breyer, Justice Kennedy, all have made it a focus after leaving the bench to look at how in the K through 12 system, for example, we are or are not educating young people about our constitutional system. And when you look at the statistics, it's shocking how many high school seniors don't know what the 3 branches of government are. And so thinking about, are there ways in communities that you live in to try to make sure that that basic civics education, how does our Constitution work? How does democracy work? Is that getting out in your community? Are there ways you can do it through community organizations, through your church or your synagogue or other religious place that you tend? What are the ways that we can get some of those lessons out to people?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Condi.
Just very briefly, we've also seen the polarization of expertise. Mm-hmm. And I was listening when you said having experts from both sides, and one thing we're trying to do at Hoover, actually, Mike Boskin, economics professor, is doing this, is bringing experts together who may disagree on the roots of inflation. And let's say, what are your assumptions? What data are you using? Because I do think we have a problem increasingly as experts, that you just trot out the expert who thinks this, you trot out the expert who thinks that, and it might actually even be helpful if people recognize that experts behaved in the way
Absolutely.
that you were talking about. But I was just going to mention one thing about family, one thing that I learned in diplomacy. And I was not always in the room with people who shared my values. There's been a lot of talk about sharing values. Sometimes you actually don't share values. And what I found in those circumstances was that I needed not to transmit quite so much. The American Secretary of State in particular, everybody wants to hear what you say, but you can shut down a room very quickly. And so it was often helpful to say, let me hear from you first, and just to listen, because sometimes, even if you don't share a core, you're trying to just have a conversation in which you might come to a conclusion, some interest that you share and the like. And particularly in families, you will share values. But if the turkey's not going to get cold while you are arguing, you probably want to get past these conversations into something that is nicer, and sometimes having a chance where you're not really just transmitting, letting other people talk is always a good way to do that.
One other thing that I think has made this whole process more problematic over the last couple of years is this idea of fake news and this idea of false information, even when things are on videotape. So we used to be able to fight disinformation with facts, but that's not necessarily working anymore. So do any of you have any suggestions for how they can go out into their lives and with people that they disagree with? It's not anymore just a disagreement, it's sometimes that people are believing false information, and how do you possibly argue or find civility in that?
So I'll build on civic education with another Stanford example. We have at the School of Education a very impressive little outfit, not very well known, called the Social Science History Education Group, founded by a remarkable professor, now emeritus but still teaching, named Sam Weinberg. And they've been promoting, I think, very well-informed, well-structured, balanced, and substantive history education that's also civics education. But more recently, they've developed a framework for giving young people tools to verify information. And the critical thing is that when information comes to you in a pillar, you can't keep just clicking down that rat hole. You have to step outside of it, open another window in the browser, and independently start searching for verification with a range of credible news sources. And then often you find this is just absurd. And it's a skill that can be taught. I think we need to teach it. I will say that the social science evidence shows that it's not the young people who are the worst in this regard in terms of blindly, I'm glad some people in this room are laughing, in terms of blindly absorbing whatever they see on the internet. It's people our age.
Yes.
I'll just tell a story about that, which is my high school age daughters have had some of that training in their high school, and had a pretty hilarious conversation with my husband where they began asking him, "What's your source for that? What's your source for that?" It didn't go well for him, let me just say. So that training works. It works, yeah.
Well, when I started in the news business, there are plenty of stories I wanted to report on, but I didn't have two sources. And that was the rule of law.
Yeah.
And that has just completely gone out the window, which I don't want to go down the whole rabbit hole of that, but social media helped with
I have to tell you that I heard on a couple of occasions that is too good to check.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the media has something to...
That's where we are, and then what ended up happening was that with social media and digital media, that instead of publications actually doing their own sourcing, we're now in an environment where everyone always wanted to be first, but now everyone is really first. It's much more rapid, and they don't do their own sourcing, so they just reprint what somebody else put out there, and they say, according to such and such, right? And that's the way they cover their butts. But that's not the way we used to do journalism in the old days.
On many of the most contentious issues, journalistic organizations will have fact checks, like the Washington Post does and others. And Google and some other aggregators have databases of fact checks. And you can look up the fact check. Actually, they put a lot of effort into sorting through what the real story is. So I would consult such things. And sometimes there's a factoid, not a fact, that somebody just grabs onto and they hold onto, and it's the basis. For example, in that video about immigration, and we've done lots of other issues besides immigration, but on that video about immigration, in the small groups, one of the groups I was listening to, they were absolutely convinced that undocumented immigrants did not pay taxes, but they were getting all these benefits. And once they finally understood that immigrants and undocumented immigrants pay a lot of taxes, they pay sales taxes, many of their, in much of their employment, they're helping to actually keep the Social Security Trust Fund afloat because they're paying in and they're not actually getting anything out. And they're not, they tend to commit less crimes because they don't want, than the rest of the population, because they don't want to be apprehended and sent back. People had to think about it, and eventually they would come around to correcting a bit of information that is crucially situated in the arguments that they were making. Now, of course, there are lots of other arguments, but that was one that people get dug in on.
Interesting. Well, in the limited time that we have remaining, I know that we're all feeling fatigue with this divide in America right now. So I want to end on a positive note if we can. So the last question for all of the panelists, if you can just take 30 seconds to give your one takeaway for how we can bridge the divide.
Well, I'll start with a slightly different answer. There's a tidal wave technologically coming in the form of deep fakes and the intense utilization of artificial intelligence tools to hyperventilate disinformation. And there are technological tools that can help us fight that, because we not only need to identify what's real, and if you'll remember the line, what's Memorex, none of our students here would. But we need credible explanations of why and technical demonstrations of that. And here, Stanford can make a big difference. And I'll just say on the hopeful front, we have a recent Stanford graduate in computer science. He's actually Israeli and is now preoccupied with something else, who's formed a company in Israel that is actually developing amazing digital tools to identify deep fakes and show how and why they should be recognized as deep fakes. So there is a technological dimension to this.
That's optimistic.
I'll say something great about our Stanford students. I think it's easy when you look in the news media or online to think that all young people don't want to hear ideas they disagree with, don't understand the value of the things we've been talking about. And I think it's another example of where you hear the loudest voices amplified on social media and in the news. And I would say, from my experience with our students in the classroom and on campus, that actually the great majority of our students are eager to engage with ideas, to learn more about the world, and to grapple with their disagreements. And so I actually think that when you get down on the ground, that there is a lot more reason for optimism about this generation and about our students than you would see from reading the newspaper.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. It's the most public-minded generation that I've taught in all these years of teaching. I will say this, I do have to say to them, you actually don't have a constitutional right not to be offended. And we need to keep reminding them that sometimes conversations are hard. I'd just say one other thing. You know, there are 330 million Americans, about 256 million are adults. If each and every one of us actually tried to practice what we keep saying we want, which is we will reach across, we will talk to people who are different, we won't fly off the handle, it might be a different conversation. And if every time you get a chance to ask a political leader a question, why not ask them that question? Mm-hmm. Why are you sowing discord? Do you believe in compromise? And see what you get.
I like that, Condi. Tim?
Well, the Stanford students are smart. That's how we survive. My little lab for deliberative democracy employs lots of Stanford students, and we only have to pay, we're only allowed to pay them a certain amount. And so we have whole teams of them and some of them are technical, some of them are in computer science, but some of them are doing the research for all the projects we do. And we can actually, with the Stanford students behind us, we can compete with anybody around the world because they're great. As for AI, it's very interesting that I was shocked to find out that a lot of these chatbots can hallucinate or do hallucinate. So they will actually give fake information. And they'll even write pseudo-student papers with fake references. So you have to check everything. So there's a promise of technology as a solution and as the progenitor of new problems. So nothing replaces critical thinking. And that's what the university should foster. And that's what the university alumni should foster. And the future of democracy is in the hands of those who are thinking critically.
Great way to end. Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion and got some takeaways from it, and thank you very much to the esteemed panel up here. Thank you for coming.